Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. What I want to look at is where we are in history. I would suggest we're at a turning point. 2024 is going to be the first of a new era, not the last of the old. What we're fighting for and against, and if there's time, what are our chances, what are our strategy, what are our tactics. But as we go down that list, probably a fewer and fewer of them will actually get spoken, because I don't want to go beyond the 20-minute limit, which is the span of human attention as far as I know. Anyway, where are we in history? That's an important question, because Francis Fukuyama, the liberal philosopher, basically said that once liberal democracy was arrived, history would come to a stop, because it was the end point on the line. Once you'd achieved liberal democracy, there was nothing more to happen, because it was the coming of the millennium, if you like. Well, he's since retracted that after a number of wars broke out which weren't on his predictions. And of course, we're living in the shadow of the Ukraine war, the possibility of a Middle East war and various others, and things are not going according to plan. Liberal democracy is now being challenged by authoritarian regimes who may win in the long run. There's every possibility that the BRICS group, also called the CRIMP group, i.e. Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, will overtake us, especially if we proceed with the absolutely mad strategy of deindustrialization disguised as net zero, once again working on the liberal guilt complex of the West to basically economically castrate ourselves, for want of a better word. Anyway, this all assumes that history is linear and that it's teleological, that it's going towards the great promised land, the socialist millennium. It is, of course, derived from a religious model, which Marxists and other people have secularized while keeping the sort of, the religious aspects of philosophy. They've sort of de-religionized it, but turned it into the same concept that all history is heading towards a fixed point, the coming of the socialist millennium. Now, even if you believed in linear history, you don't have to believe that it's got an end point, and you don't have to believe it's pointing in the direction the socialists want to point it to. It might be linear, but heading in a different direction, or it might not be linear at all. I suggest that what we've actually reached is the end of a particular, what the French historian Brodel would call a conjoncture. We've reached the end of a 60-year span of moving ever further to the left. The start point would be either 63 or 68, when youth revolutions broke out all over Western Europe and elsewhere. But the idea would be that we are coming to the end of one period of time and starting another one. And I would suggest 2024 is the start year of a new period. It may just be my personal impression, but I had the feeling throughout the 80s, 90s and the early part of this century that however hard nationalists tried, we were swimming against the current of history. I don't know if you had the same feeling, but it was like the zeitgeist was ever more liberalism, ever more equalization was what people wanted subconsciously. And however good the arguments we could put forward, we were struggling against the tide. Well, if you look around what's happening in Europe in the recent Euro elections and the elections in Saxony and Thuringia and elsewhere, I think we have gone past that point, we have exhausted it, and we're heading in a different direction. What is particularly significant is it's the young people who are voting. We can debate whether it's far right or nationalist, but you know what I mean. It is the young people who are leading this charge. For instance, Le Pen's voters, most of the young, a disproportionate number of the young are voting for her, and Macron's main supporters are aged over 60. This is a pattern repeated not only across Europe, but in America. A lot of young people are voting for something which their parents would have rejected. So we can have another concept of history, which is that it's pendular, that the second law of thermodynamics operates in the political sphere as well as the mechanical. In other words, people are reacting against 60 years of being brainwashed and having ideas shoved down their throats. When I went to school, church assembly was still practiced every day. We sang hymns and had religion shoved down our throat. As a result, all my contemporaries are atheists or agnostics. They just had enough of it and they rebelled against it. What I think is happening now is that young people are rebelling against 60 years of political correctness. Time will tell, but I think what's actually happening is they are pushing back against the orthodoxy which has been shoved down their throats in schools, by the media, for the last 60 years, and they are rebelling against it. They are pushing back. So you can have a pendular concept of time. You can go further and have a cyclical concept of time and say what goes around comes around. That just as the Victorian era was not prolonged indefinitely into the past, it was a reaction against the excesses of the 18th century. The 18th century was a time of great libertinism. It itself was a reaction against the Civil War period and the rest of it. So history can be seen as the turning of a wheel, as it is in many religions. Hinduism is one of the most obvious ones. But not everybody has ever been in love with the idea that history is linear or that it's directional. It might even be quite random and stochastic for all we know. But for the moment, it looks very much as if 2024 could be the beginnings of maybe 60 years of a new conjuncture in which we row back against everything that's been achieved by the left. Now, this is a body blow to left-wing thought, because according to them, you can't have kinks in the historical line, the progression towards the wonderful future that they promise us. You can't have turnings back, because history is only going in one direction, their direction, and anything which goes against that, they will say, but you can't put the clock back. As Andrew Bronze, until recently Deputy Chairman of the party, said, he actually quoted G.K. Chesterton. Anybody that says you can't turn the clock back doesn't know much about the workings of clocks. That's precisely what you can do. But there's another way of looking at it still. When you've got a prime minister, or as he then was, a prime ministerial candidate, who says he doesn't know what a woman was, and that women can have penises, then you might actually think that people have departed from the real world altogether. In other words, the last 60 years might not be just a conjuncture, but a total departure from reality, an aberration. And what we're actually doing is discussing what, again, the French historian Fernand Braudel would describe as the longue durée. Quite simply, that millennia of people have believed that they knew that men were men and women were women, and that if the political class have gone off on a tangent, it is not even a short-term conjuncture, it's a departure from reality which is being corrected. We're simply going back to what normal human beings have believed for thousands of years, and which we have basically inherited from our ape ancestors. It is simply continuous with the rest of the animal kingdom, that men are men and women are women, and we don't confuse the two. So I think we can look at the situation we are in now and have some optimism. Remember the old Taoist proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with but a few steps. To say that we're not moving very fast towards the right is to forget that the left didn't achieve everything it's achieved over the last 60 years. Nobody saw that coming. In fact, if they'd gone to the people, if they'd been democratic and said, this is what we are aiming at, they would have been completely voted out of office. The left has succeeded by keeping everything quiet and advancing by what are known as salami tactics, a little slice at a time. They know where they're going, they've got their strategy in mind, but they don't let the people know what's in store for them until the very last minute. That is what Starmer did before the last election. Whenever he was asked what he was going to do, he told you what he wasn't going to do, evading all possible questions so that he couldn't be held hostage to a particular promise. This is a window of opportunity which we can't afford to miss. Now, when I say the next question I was going to address is, what are we fighting for? What are we fighting against? Well, we're fighting against the big lie. The big lie is that a multicultural society can work. The big lie is that everybody's come into this country with the good wishes of the inhabitants, that we wished for this situation, and that everybody will get on like a house on fire. But it will only get on like a house on fire in the Hare Hill sense that houses will be set on fire. What we've got is a total lie which defies, just as women having penises, it defies everything that human beings have understood up to the present, which is that diversity is not strength. We are promised diversity, equity, and inclusiveness. Most of the ethnic groups that arrived in this country can't stand the sight of each other. They're not inclusive towards each other. Equity doesn't just mean equality of opportunity, which is a traditional British belief, which is enshrined in law. It means equality of outcome. In other words, even lazy, inefficient, or frankly quite low IQ ethnic groups coming in this country must get the same rewards as those who work hard. So that Hong Kong Chinese who have a high IQ will not be allowed to have more success than low IQ immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa with an IQ of about 70. In other words, the outcome is going to be predetermined by ethnicity. Well, if that isn't racism, I don't know what is. It's saying basically your ethnic group guarantees your future. Now, that is absolutely, totally racist. It doesn't allow for the fact that races are very varied in terms of their life strategies. If you've read any of the works of Ed Dutton or Matthew Woodley, you'll know Michael Woodley, you'll know what I'm talking about. Different human groups have different ways of coping with the environment. In sub-Saharan Africa, there is a premium on having lots of kids, but not particularly looking after them. It's rather like squid or whatever, squirting out thousands of eggs and hoping some will survive. East Asians are the exact opposite. They have a K strategy, which means they look after their kids but have few of them, and they achieve a great deal. The East Asian achievement is so high that they're now given quotas at Yale and Harvard because, as one professor pointed out, if it was done on merit alone, Yale and Harvard would be a sea of yellow faces with the odd white one and nothing darker than light brown. In other words, success has to be controlled from the top to achieve this great socialist millennium, which doesn't look very much like equity, inclusiveness, and it's certainly going to be very diverse. But that's the big lie we're fighting. We're fighting for the truth, which is that human beings work best when they're surrounded by other human beings of the same type, and therefore they have a common interest. Once it becomes basically a question of small groups fighting for a share of the pizza, you're never going to get a happy society. That is the lesson that goes back over millennia, and it's the lesson that the big lie is trying to convince us is not true. So I'm not going to spend too much time on what are our chances, but our chances are never going to be greater than now, where the two big parties are either discredited already, the Tories by 14 years, or discredit themselves by the minute. I don't think anybody expected Starmer to drop quite so many clangers as to take money away from old age pensioners and the rest of it, or the blatant attempts to limit our freedom of speech which are in the pipeline. That they've dropped, for instance, the requirement for academic freedom on university campuses to accommodate the Chinese government. Nobody expected they would discredit themselves so fast. Reform have got 5 seats, and that's probably all they're going to get, given the first-past-the-post system. It is going to be very hard for them to grow on that. They may be the party that people think of first, but that's because the first-past-the-post system is a stumbling block for all small parties. The big danger, therefore, is that people conclude that there's absolutely no point in voting for anybody whatsoever because it's simply a waste of time, that nothing they do is going to change their future. Now, as British Democrats, we've got to say, A, that we're more authentic than Reform. We really believe in what we're saying. B, we're not controlled by a few rich men who own the party, who by taking their money away from it would bankrupt it overnight. So we can be genuinely democratic. Now, I did say to a few people that there are rumours that Reform is in fact going to split down the middle, but not on an ideological basis as much as a youth basis. That the younger members of the Reform Party are growing extremely dissatisfied with rule by Farage and Tice and want to follow Ben Habib in a different direction. It's for us to try and exploit that and win as many of those people as possible, but in order to do that, we're going to have to enter into a dialogue with them. Our problem, therefore, is quite simply the recognition factor. Now, I want to conclude by pointing out tactics and strategy. We are still dedicated to the ladder strategy, which is we expect to do well at the parish council and district council level, precisely where Reform is weak. They do not have organisations like ours on down to the community level basis. They've shown very little interest in it in the past. Even UKIP wasn't exactly noted for the quality of its councillors because their focus was entirely on Parliament. They were aiming at the parliamentary level and everything else was basically auxiliary. Now, we are working on a different strategy. We pursue the ladder strategy that we want to start at the bottom and work up. Now, there's a very important reason for this, given first past the post. Labour and Tory always did well because their votes were concentrated. In the case of reform, what you've got is a diffuse, but you've got a party which is popular, but in a very diffuse way, with no foci. And that is not going to get any more MPs. So it's perfectly logical for us to aim for an Isle of Dogs situation. Steve Smith is present, he knows what I'm talking about. What we have to do is have one constituency in which we do particularly well and can eventually become the party of choice. That means starting at the bottom and working up so that we're deeply rooted in the community and they think of us as the natural party to vote for. We can't do that, and we don't want to do that, in 650 constituencies. We only need one, and that will act as a beacon, and then others will follow, because the problem is one of credibility. It's one that all smaller parties face. People will say, isn't voting for you a wasted vote? Well, it isn't in the context of two totally discredited major parties. The Lib Dems are not spoken of outside the southwest as the natural party of government, and perhaps a few home counties constituencies where people are affluent enough to be Lib Dems. We have to pick a particular constituency and home in on it, and then gradually build up that majority. And remember, given the number of parties often standing, it doesn't have to be a very high threshold to be one nose ahead of the opposition, because, as I say, the votes are going to be diffused in future over several parties. So why in that case did we stand in the general election, though, knowing full well that we weren't going to score particularly high results? The answer was purely and simply that the recognition factor requires that we make ourselves known to as many people as possible. The mail drop by Royal Mail in the areas around Basildon and Maidstone and Doncaster have reached more people than we would ever reach by normal footbound leafleting. It is just the start of trying to follow through on that and use parliamentary elections, where there will be by-elections and so on in future. If we participate in several reasonable ones, then we will make ourselves known and at least enter people's consciousness as something they can vote for. And it will be a question of whether they believe we're more authentic than Reform, not just to the fact that we don't appear on GB News quite as often. And one point that we are aiming for in next year's elections, we're not only going to be standing in county councils like Essex and Kent and probably Cambridgeshire, but we're also going to be standing for the mayoralty of Doncaster. Now, that area encompasses 3 parliamentary constituencies, one of which we've already stood for, Doncaster North, plus Doncaster East and Doncaster Central. The only reason for standing is to get a little booklet containing our leaflet distributed across 3 parliamentary constituencies. Had the election taken place not in spring but in autumn, I was intending to stand for the party in Castleford, Normanton, Pontefract, i.e. against Yvette Cooper. The final point is, when we're standing against high-profile people like the Home Secretary, and when we were standing in Doncaster North, it was against Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, or whatever he calls himself, the man pushing the whole net zero agenda, which is unachievable and unaffordable, and would result in 90% of the population having no car transport in the future, if it's ever honoured. By going after high-profile targets like that, we will get mentioned. Every time that constituency is mentioned, they will say, and the British Democrats represented by Frank Calladine or whoever. And that is all we want to do in the next year. It may be a small step, but it is a very important step that as many people as possible simply are aware of our existence. Many more people than we can reach on foot with leafleting, even with the most active leafleters. Now, as I say, if we can capture a significant chunk of dissident Reform vote, if we can get the young people, thank you for the musical reminder that it's time to finish my speech, But anyway, if we can capture a significant quantity of the youthful reform membership, we will get the leafleters we need. I think at that point I'll finish the speech, because I hope I haven't bored you too much, but I think it makes a logical direction of progress that if we concentrate on pursuing the letter strategy, but combine it with putting out leaflets over the maximum possible area in selected constituencies, we will both make ourselves known and have the opportunity, because unlike other parties, we do leaflet on the ground. In Doncaster North, we were the only party that put out leaflets on foot. So we were the only party... We were the only party that engaged people in conversation on the doorsteps. We were the only party that could answer questions asked directly of us. You can't ask a question, if you like, of a website or whatever in the same way. But people could look us in the eye on the doorstep and say, so what do the British Democrats stand for then? And we're going to continue that policy because it's the only way, but it may take a decade to win people over. But the point is, if we don't start now and we don't start as actively as possible, then even that decade will be wasted and we can't afford to waste another decade for future generations of Britons. Thank you very much for your attention.